The phone call came on a Tuesday, right in the middle of my shift. I was elbow deep in changing the bed linens of a woman in room 14 who hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 years, and a number I didn't recognize lit up my phone on the bedside table. I ignored it. I always ignored unknown numbers. I had learned that unknown numbers meant either bill collectors or my mother pretending to be someone new so I would pick up. I didn't know that the voicemail that followed would be the thing that tore my entire life clean open. My name is Danny Cole. I am 28 years old. I work the overnight shift at Sunrise Gardens, a long-term care facility outside Hartfield, Indiana that smells permanently of industrial floor wax and canned green beans, and the particular kind of loneliness that settles into a building when too many people inside it are waiting for something they can't name. I am a CNA, a certified nursing assistant, which means I am the person who does the things that nurses and doctors are too important and too expensive to do themselves. I lift, I clean, I reposition, I bathe and dress and feed people who once ran businesses and raised families and now cannot remember the word for water. I am the hands that hold them when they cry at 3 a.m. for children who stopped visiting. I am the person who changes the sheets and doesn't tell anyone. I chose this work because machines don't interest me, but people do. I chose it because it is real. You cannot fake a clean wound or a repositioned patient. Either the work is done or it isn't, and nobody in this building cares what I drove to work in or what neighborhood I grew up in. They only care that I show up and that my hands are gentle. My hands are always gentle. I am less gentle with everything else. I have lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner on Willow Street for 4 years. The rent is modest. The radiator knocks like something is trying to escape it every November through March. I have a second-hand couch and a good set of scrubs in 3 colors and a savings account I empty on a semi-regular basis into the ongoing financial emergency that is my family. My father, Gary, is a man built entirely out of good intentions and bad follow-through. He has started 11 businesses in the last 15 years. All 11 are gone. He is, in his own frequent description, between opportunities. My mother, Renee, is a woman who has organized her entire personality around how things appear to people who will never care about her as much as she needs them to. She volunteers at the church, joins every committee, and has strong opinions about the importance of owning a home with a 2-car garage. She tells people her older daughter works in healthcare. She says it the way you'd mention a necessary surgery, technically impressive but not something you'd bring up at dinner. My younger sister Amber is the dinner conversation. Amber is in real estate. Amber has a boyfriend who owns a boat. Amber got her teeth whitened last spring and has been photographing them ever since. When my parents introduce us at family events, there is a specific beat of hesitation before my name, as if they are deciding in real time whether to include me or to skip ahead to the part that reflects better on them. I pay their car insurance. I paid the gap on my father's tax debt 3 winters ago. I covered my sister's security deposit when she moved to her new apartment because, and I am quoting here, she had a cash flow issue that month. The cash flow issue was a weekend trip she took with her boyfriend to Nashville that she posted about extensively online. I have never been to Nashville. I barely leave Hartfield. This is not a complaint, or it wasn't. It was just the shape of my life, the landscape I had grown so used to. I stopped noticing it was strange. The voicemail waited for me until my break at 2 a.m. I sat in the staff lounge under a flickering fluorescent light with a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration, and I pressed play. The voice was measured, professional, with the specific cadence of someone accustomed to delivering important information to people who are not ready to receive it. My name is Thomas Greer. I am a partner at Greer & Associates, a law firm based out of Carmel, Indiana. I am attempting to reach Danielle Lynn Cole regarding a matter of some legal significance following the passing of Mr. Leonard Marsh. If you could return my call at your earliest convenience, I would be grateful. He left a number, and his direct extension, Leonard Marsh. The name meant nothing to me. I sat with the coffee going cold in my hand and turned the name over. Leonard Marsh. I had lived in Hartfield my entire life. Everyone knew the Marsh name. The Marsh grain elevators stood along the county highway like rusted monuments. The Marsh family had built half the commercial district in the 80s before the family business contracted and then quietly, in the way of old money, retreated into itself. Leonard Marsh had died 2 weeks prior. It had been front-page news in the Hartfield Gazette, which still ran a print edition for the 12 people in town who preferred their tragedy on paper. I had no connection to that family. I barely had a connection to my own. I almost deleted the message. I decided instead to call back in the morning, after my shift, mostly because I needed something to do to keep myself from thinking about how tired I was, and how the savings account looked, and how my father had texted me 3 days ago about a quote he'd gotten for new gutters on the house that he framed as a question, but that we both understood was not a question at all. I called Thomas Greer at 8:45 the next morning from the parking lot of a gas station, still in my scrubs, with my hair coming out of its braid. He picked up on the second ring. He told me that I had been named as a party of interest in the estate of Leonard Marsh. He told me that Mr. Marsh had left specific instructions requiring my physical presence at the formal reading of his will, which was scheduled for the following Friday at their offices in Carmel. He used the phrase legally significant twice. He used the phrase personal bequest once, and then immediately said he could not elaborate. I asked him frankly if this was some kind of mistake. He paused, just long enough. Then he said that it was not a mistake, that my name and my address and my employer had been included in Mr. Marsh's documents with considerable specificity, and that he would very much appreciate my attendance. I said I would be there. I called my mother on the drive home. I don't know why. Force of habit probably, the reflex of 28 years. I told her about the call. There was a silence on the other end that had texture to it. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of someone recalibrating. Then she said, very carefully, that it was probably an administrative thing. Something to do with the facility, she said, since I worked in elder care. They probably needed a staff witness for some paperwork. She said she would come with me. She said it in the tone she used when she meant, "We will come with you," which was what she said next. I said I could manage on my own. She said, "Honey, this is clearly related to something professional at your job. You need your family there with you. You don't know how to handle these kinds of formal settings." This is a woman who has watched me single-handedly manage the transfer of a 200-pound patient at 3 in the morning without waking anyone in the neighboring rooms. She was not concerned about my ability to handle a law firm. She was concerned about what might be in that room and whether her family should be positioned to access it first. I told her I would call her afterward. I drove the 40 minutes to Carmel on a gray Friday morning with the heat in my car cranking on high and my one good blazer from Target hanging in the back seat in a dry cleaning bag I had never opened. The offices of Greer & Associates were in a glass building that reflected the November sky like a cold mirror. I wore the blazer and my good black pants and the flat shoes I wore to church funerals, and I walked into a lobby that made me immediately aware of my dry cleaner's apartment and my knocking radiator and every single hour I had ever worked for wages that didn't quite meet the month. Thomas Greer was not what I expected. He was younger than his voice suggested, mid-50s, with tired eyes and an air of careful professionalism that came from decades of delivering news that rearranged people's lives. He met me in the lobby himself, which I would later understand was because of the specific nature of what he was about to do. The conference room was small. 6 chairs, a glass table, a window overlooking a parking structure. Compared to the reading I had imagined, it was almost modest. But there were documents stacked in precise piles, and there were 2 sealed envelopes with my name written in a handwriting I did not recognize. And there was another man in the room, older, silent, who Thomas introduced only as a witness retained by the estate. Thomas Greer sat down. He folded his hands. He looked at me with those tired eyes and he said, "Before we proceed, I am obligated to ask you a question on behalf of Mr. Marsh." He left specific instruction for this to be the first thing said in this meeting. He unfolded a single piece of paper. He read, "Do you remember the woman in room 7? The world tilted. Room 7, Sunrise Gardens. A woman we called Mrs. Walsh. She had been a resident for 11 months before she passed in September. She was small and sharp, and her eyes were the specific alert brown of someone who has always been paying closer attention than people gave her credit for. She had no visitors. She had no family listed on her intake form. She requested the window bed, and she read actual books, not large print, which at 81 was its own kind of statement. I had liked her immediately. In this work you learn fast who sees you and who doesn't, and Mrs. Walsh saw everyone. She remembered the aides' names and their schedules and whether they seemed tired. She asked questions that were not small talk. She asked me once, during a night shift when I was fixing her blanket and the whole building was quiet, what I thought the difference was between a life that mattered and a life that was used up. I told her I thought the difference was whether you decided it for yourself or let other people decide it for you. She had looked at me for a long moment. Then she had said, "Good answer." She gave me a small jade plant when I admired it once. She told me to keep it on a windowsill and not to overwater it. I still have it. Thomas Greer waited while I came back to the room. "Mrs. Walsh," I said. "Yes. I remember her." He nodded. He set down the paper. Her full name, he said, was Margaret Walsh Alderman. She was Leonard Marsh's personal attorney and his closest friend for 31 years. She came to Sunrise Gardens at his request, roughly a year before his death, to observe. To observe what? I asked. My voice was very flat. He held my gaze. "You," he said. He opened the first file. What he told me next? "I will try to give you in order." Because when it was happening, it did not come in order. It came the way a building comes down in sections, one support giving way, then another, then the whole structure dropping. 29 years ago, Leonard Marsh had a daughter named Beth. She was 23, the only child of his first marriage, and she was by all accounts her father's contradiction made human. She had his intelligence and his stubbornness, and absolutely none of his appetite for money. She worked as a physical therapist at a county clinic. She drove a car that was old when she bought it. She was in love with a man her father disapproved of, a man named Patrick Cole. Patrick Cole was my father's younger brother, who died in a car accident when I was 8 months old. I knew this. My father, Gary, had told me about his brother in the vague, simplified way adults explain death to children, and then the subject was mostly dropped. What Gary had never told me, what I had never been told by anyone in my entire life, was that Beth Marsh had been in that car. Beth died in the accident. Patrick died. And 8 months prior, they had had a baby girl together. A baby who, by the time of the accident, had been living for a month with Gary and Renee Cole, Patrick's brother and sister-in-law, in an informal arrangement while Beth and Patrick got settled. An arrangement that was never supposed to be permanent. After the accident, Leonard Marsh was left with a choice. He was 61 years old. He had just buried his daughter. He had a grandchild who was technically being cared for by his dead son-in-law's family, people he did not know, people with no legal claim, people who were already struggling. He could have stepped in. He could have filed for custody. He had the resources and, arguably, the rights. He did not. He made, as he wrote in a letter that Thomas Greer now slid across the glass table to me, the choice of a coward wrapped in the logic of a businessman. He paid Gary and Renee Cole a substantial sum of money, enough to buy their house outright, enough to cover childcare and education, and every practical expense a child might generate through the age of 18, in exchange for their agreement to raise me quietly, as their own, with no contact from the Marsh family, and no disclosure of my biological parentage. They signed it. They took the money. Thomas Greer was quiet while I read the letter. I read it twice. The handwriting was old-fashioned and deliberate, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a different era, and the words were not soft. Leonard Marsh was not a man who softened things. He wrote that he had watched from a distance and had seen, with increasing guilt and rage, how the money had been spent and how I had been used, and that he had decided, late and imperfectly, to correct his mistake. I put the letter down. I thought about the summer I was 17, sitting at the kitchen table with a letter from Indiana University with my name on the envelope, and watching my mother open it before I could. She had scanned it and said, with that practiced casual delivery she had for things she'd already decided, that it was just an informational mailing. They send these to everyone, Danny. It doesn't mean you got in. She put it in the recycling bin. I fished it out 3 days later when the house was empty. It was a full tuition scholarship, conditional on my enrollment by the following April deadline. I had missed the deadline by 6 weeks. I thought about the year I was 22, working double shifts at a diner and a grocery store simultaneously to pay for my CNA certification, because there was no money. There was never any money. and my parents both said simultaneously and separately that they wished they could help. I thought about last Christmas, when my mother cried because I had only contributed $200 to the holiday gifts budget and she felt like the family wasn't being prioritized. I had just paid their property taxes. I looked at Thomas Greer. My voice was very steady. I spent a lot of time at work learning to keep my voice steady so patients don't feel scared. "Where did the money go?" I asked. He opened a second file. He was prepared for this question. He laid out pages carefully, like a doctor laying out films. It was a financial accounting going back 26 years. It was long. It was detailed. It was a documentation of a fortune being converted, quietly and consistently, into a life that looked comfortable from the outside and was empty at the center. The house, 2 cars, then 3. My sister Amber's private school tuition, a vacation to Florida, then another. My father's business investments, a kitchen renovation. My mother's credit cards, item by item, categories like clothing, spa, and entertaining that accumulated like slow water damage. The fund Leonard Marsh had designated for my housing, healthcare, and education, transferred in full to a joint account in my parents' names, spent down to nothing by the time I turned 19. And after it was gone, the account they had turned to was mine. I thought about Mrs. Walsh. I thought about her sitting in room 7 with her alert brown eyes and her real books and her jade plant. I thought about her asking me what I thought the difference was between a life that mattered and a life that was used up. She had already known. Thomas Greer let me sit with it. He was good at his job. He didn't rush the silence. After a while, he said that Leonard Marsh had left 2 paths. He called them the first option and the second option, and he described them in the even, careful tone of a man who had done this before and knew that neither word was adequate for what it was actually asking. The first option, a lifetime annuity for Gary and Renee Cole, funded by the Marsh estate, modest but stable. It would require as a condition my ongoing participation in the family relationship. Legal language for, you must continue to be their daughter, publicly and privately, and you may not disclose the terms of this arrangement to anyone outside the parties involved. The money came with a leash. The leash had my neck in it. The second option, no annuity. The funds instead redirected into a new foundation, the Beth Marsh Memorial Fund, focused on scholarships for CNA and nursing certification programs for low-income applicants in Indiana, plus a controlling financial interest in the remaining Marsh properties, including 2 commercial buildings in downtown Hartfield, held in trust for me. The foundation would be chaired by whoever I designated. Leonard had suggested, in writing, that I might consider chairing it myself. Thomas Greer closed both files and folded his hands again. He looked at me. He said, "Mr. Marsh also left a personal letter, separate from the legal documents. He intended it for you alone. He said if you want it, it's yours. If you don't, it stays sealed." I held out my hand. I drove back to Hartfield with the letter in the passenger seat. I didn't open it until I was sitting in my apartment with the jade plant on the windowsill and the radiator knocking and the dry cleaner's equipment humming through the floor below me. The familiar sounds of my life as I had built it, on my own, without anyone's help, without anyone's money, without anyone giving me a single thing I hadn't earned myself. The handwriting was the same deliberate script. "Danny," it began, "I don't have the right to call you that, and I'm going to do it anyway because I have watched you for a year through Margaret's eyes, and you are the least formal person I have ever encountered, which I mean as the highest possible compliment." He wrote about Beth. He wrote about her the way people write about water they are still thirsty for. She was stubborn, he wrote. She thought I was wrong about most things, and she was usually correct. She would have been furious with me for what I did. She also would have understood it. Which is the thing about knowing someone well, you understand their worst choices even when you can't forgive them. He wrote that Margaret had called him from Sunrise Gardens in February and told him that Beth's daughter was there, that she was working the overnight shift, that she had come into Margaret's room at 2 a.m. to replace a blanket that had slipped, and instead of leaving immediately, she had stayed, and she had asked how Margaret was sleeping, and when Margaret said poorly, she had sat on the edge of the chair and talked with her until Margaret felt settled enough to try again. He wrote, "Margaret said you told her that some nights the building gets so quiet it feels like the whole world stopped moving, and that on those nights she should try to think of it as the world resting instead. She said you talked about the difference for almost 20 minutes. He wrote, I tried to visit that facility 3 times. I turned around in the parking lot each time. I am telling you this not for sympathy but because you deserve to know that the cowardice was consistent. He wrote, I cannot give you back the years or the money or the scholarship or the choices that were taken from you. What I can do is make sure that from here forward, nothing in your life is subject to their consent. The second option is not a reward, it is a door. What you do once you walk through it is entirely your business. He wrote, near the end of the page, in a handwriting that had grown slightly less steady. Margaret told me that when you helped the woman in room 12 through a difficult night last spring, you told her that dignity was not something a person earned, that it was something a person simply had, and that anyone who spent their time making you feel you had to earn it was lying to you for their own benefit. She said you believed it completely when you said it. I hope you still do. His name was at the bottom. Just Leonard, no title, no Marsh. I sat with the letter for a long time. Then I called Thomas Greer and told him I had made my decision. My parents arrived at my apartment 2 nights later without calling first, which was a habit they had maintained for my entire adult life on the premise that I was always available to them and that calling ahead implied a formality that family didn't require. My mother had brought a casserole dish. My father had brought his expression of wounded dignity that he wore whenever he suspected the conversation would involve accountability. My sister was not there. She had sent 3 texts over the previous 48 hours, ranging in tone from anxious to accusatory. The last one said, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to remember that Mom and Dad gave up a lot for us, and whatever that old man's lawyers are telling you, it doesn't erase everything they sacrificed. The word us was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. I let them in. I didn't offer them anything to drink. I sat across from them at my small kitchen table and I put the financial accounting on the table between us. Not all of it. Just the first page, which was enough. I looked at my father, who was looking at the table, and my mother, who was looking at me with the expression she used when she was gauging how much I already knew, so she could calibrate how much to admit. I asked them if it was true. My father's face did something complicated. He pressed his hands flat against the table. He looked at his own hands. He said, It's more complicated than whatever those lawyers put in a document. I said I would like to hear the less complicated version. My mother said, Danny, we took you in when you had no one. Patrick was gone. That woman's family wanted nothing to do with any of us. You were a baby. We fed you and clothed you and put you in a home and we loved you. And yes, there was money, there was compensation for what we went through, for our grief, for the disruption to our lives. She said that word, disruption, without flinching. I was the disruption. I asked about the scholarship. My father made a sound. Not words, just a sound. My mother said, You were never going to leave Hartfield. You were never going to go to Bloomington and live in a dormitory and become some kind of... She stopped. She organized herself. You belong here, she said, more quietly. You have always belonged here. We needed you here. That was the truest thing she had ever said to me, and it was an accusation and a confession at the same time. I told them I was choosing the second option. I told them there would be no annuity. I told them I was not going to sign a document requiring me to maintain a family relationship as a legal condition of anything, because I was not a financial instrument and I had spent long enough being one. I told them that I had found a number for a social services office that could walk them through options for housing assistance given their current financial situation, and that I was happy to share it. My mother stood up. Her voice rose to the specific register she used when she was both genuinely hurt and weaponizing that hurt simultaneously. After everything, she said, after everything we did, you would do this to us. You have money now. You have more money than you will ever need. You would leave your own parents too. She stopped. She started again. You are cruel, Danny. I raised a cruel daughter. I looked at her. At this woman who had taken a check for my existence and spent it and then turned to me and spent me too. I was not cruel. I was tired. You didn't raise a daughter, I said. You raised a bank account that walked and talked and changed bedpans at Sunrise Gardens so you could tell people at church you had a daughter in healthcare. I'm not doing it anymore. My father left without speaking. My mother took the casserole dish. The door closed, and the apartment went quiet, and the radiator knocked, and the dry cleaner hummed below, and the jade plant sat in the window in the November dark, small and alive and not overwatered, exactly the way Mrs. Walsh had instructed. The Beth Marsh Memorial Fund issued its first round of scholarship applications in March. I chaired the selection committee personally. We had 43 applicants. We funded 9 full certifications, including a woman who had been working as a waitress for 6 years while trying to save the tuition, and a man who had been a volunteer EMT in his county for 3 years without the official credentials to advance. We held the first meeting in one of the Marsh commercial buildings on Carver Street, which I had opened to a small nonprofit that ran GED classes on Tuesday and Thursday nights. I kept my job at Sunrise Gardens through the spring. I had thought I might leave, but the work didn't change just because my circumstances did. The woman in room 14 still needed her sheets changed. The man in room 9 still needed someone to sit with him when the nights got long. The work was real and I was good at it, and it mattered to the people who received it. I did eventually move out of the apartment above the dry cleaner. I found a place on the east side of Hartfield with a window that faced the fields and a radiator that didn't knock and enough room for more than one jade plant. I did not tell my mother the new address. My sister called me 6 weeks after the meeting at my apartment, not to apologize. She never apologized. She called to tell me that I had been selfish and that she hoped I understood what I had done to the family. I listened to the whole message. Then I put my phone down and went to check on the jade plant and stood there in the window for a while, looking at the fields going brown in the early winter, and I thought about what Mrs. Walsh had asked me, what I thought the difference was between a life that mattered and a life that was used up. I had given her an answer at 2 a.m. over a slipping blanket in room 7, and I had meant it then, and I still meant it now. The difference is, who decides? The spring after that, one of the scholarship recipients, the waitress who had been saving for 6 years, sent me a card after she passed her CNA boards. She had enclosed a photo of herself in her scrubs on her first day. She was grinning in the way you grin when you have been waiting for something long enough that you stopped quite believing it would arrive. She had written, in handwriting that slanted optimistically to the right, "I almost didn't apply. I didn't think I qualified. Thank you for telling me I did." I put it on the refrigerator next to a photo of my mother, Beth, that Thomas Greer had found in Leonard's files and sent to me without my asking. She was young in the photo, younger than I am now. She had my eyes, apparently. I couldn't quite see it, but 3 different people told me. She was standing in front of a car that was clearly already old when she bought it, laughing at something off camera, looking like a person who had decided, firmly and cheerfully, to live exactly the life she wanted. I had a letter from her, too. Not to me, she had died before I was old enough to receive letters. It was to Leonard, written 6 months before the accident. Thomas Greer had included it without comment, folded in the envelope with the photo. In it, she wrote that she was happy, that the clinic work was hard and good, that she was sorry they had argued about Patrick, and that she hoped he would come around, that she thought the most important thing a person could do was refuse to let anyone else make their choices for them, no matter how much money was on the table. I read that line 4 times. I thought, my mother was right about one thing. I do belong in Hartfield, just not the way she meant it. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment below and tell me. And if this resonated with you, please subscribe to Mila Revenge Stories, hit like, and share with someone who needs to hear it today.